welcome back to this great panel. And I do have a different type of question for the Blount family to start. You know, some people like to think that owning a business is a straight line up in success. And those of us who have owned businesses and have had sleepless nights and anxiety know that that's not necessarily the case. So I'd like you to maybe try to give some of our owners who are listening a perspective of how you've been able to use mistakes or failures or changing economies to sort of make the organization or the family, and maybe the family too, better.
Excellent. Yeah, after almost 80 years, there's definitely been some ups and downs, 30 years for myself. Two things that I learned, one from my dad about how to stop things. And we've had a lot of businesses that were traditional, that were important to our customers, and we had to spend time when they were not making money or they were in decline to make difficult decisions. And then right after those decisions, the business may even suffer for a period of time because we may have lost some customers, but we knew that the future line items and product lines were going to be more important. And so those were difficult times where you took risk. We actually were a seafood company, and we actually sold our seafood assets at one point, and it was a pretty scary moment to sell the family's core business. Even though it wasn't doing bad, it just had no future, and we used those proceeds. But there was a moment where the business obviously went backwards a little bit to make that kind of shift. And you kind of, yes, wake up in the middle of the night and say, was this a good idea? Multiple people may think it's a bad idea. But then more difficult was for us, particularly during the supply chain crisis, inflation, and COVID. Definitely it was very difficult after having decades of success and increases in sales. We weren't engineered to go backwards. We weren't designed that way. And so we were always in a hire mode, in a construction mode. And it was very difficult to have to go to the bank and ask for extra line of credit to do difficult things. And at the same time, and particularly having gone through inflation, which again, depending on your age, you might have been in a different place in the 80s. I've heard stories, but until you've lived it, I think now this kind of experience of those difficult times is, number one, don't panic. And number two, be thoughtful, seek advice, and work with the team to begin to plan around those difficult times. Much less stress than there was previously, mostly because of experience, not necessarily because times are easier.
Todd, do you have a board or when you seek advice?
Yes, we do have a board of directors. That's something that even my grandfather started and always was in our DNA. And so that board is more for strategic advice on broader kind of opportunistic going forward, less for overcoming challenges. We primarily rely on, I'm in a CEO peer group, but also rely on our internal team, maybe a couple customers, a couple vendors. So I'm primarily seeking advice from the kind of closest of relationships, and then broadly for broader themes and things that take multiple years, we ask the board for help.
So how would you give advice to someone who has a closely held business on forming the board in your sense?
Yeah, so two things. One, Jeffrey actually helped me create a family counsel. The family counsel was specifically, in the beginning, the board was half family and a couple outside friends, right? Maybe a banker, maybe an attorney. And over time, that became stagnant. It was a very important time to have a meeting, but it wasn't going to be advice. So we moved the family members to the family council, where they work on things that are important to the family, but not any authority over the company itself. And then the board, we brought in outside board members who have done or are connected to the place where we want to be. So most likely from bigger companies. In our case, we wanted to be a CPG, a food, a packaged food company. So we brought in outside folks that had packaged food companies that were a little bigger than us. Some family business, so they understood that things aren't going to just go by the numbers in a 2-year cycle, and some from more public companies. And it really did make a difference. But at the same time, quite frankly, I don't want to be having a board meeting every month. because as a private company, we as I say, I hire the board, I work for the board, I can fire the board. Like, it's a little bit of a circular reference, but they're so valuable. I need them there just at the right amount, which could be every 2 times a year to 4 times a year would be my recommendation.
Sounds like a lot of work. Can you talk a little bit about how you separate family time and priorities from the business and the time committed to the business and balance that?
Yeah, I'll start, but I'll love to hear what Steven says. I think primarily, on some cases, the family time can come into the business time, right? We always talk about how to separate it from preventing business into family. The benefit of being able to have flexibility in the schedule, and then also represent both the family and the company at one time, either in a community perspective, maybe with a nonprofit, maybe with a community board, and be able to mix that's been helpful. So I always say I try and get as much done, both personal and professionally, in the 5 days of the week, so that time with family is more protected. But at the same time, my kids grew up coming to the plant on Saturdays during what we call peak season. We're in the soup business. It's not my fault. You only eat soup in the winter. So we bring the kids to the plant, so they also grew up to know, like, hey, if the employees are working, we're going to go in and just be there. So there's always been some of that, but I think it's just the ability to mix a little bit, but not. We're fortunate not to have the kind of business where it's like in your house, where you just can't separate it. Steven, how have you done it?
Yeah, I would say, growing up as a young salesman, traveling a lot, I wasn't home. I was on the road most weeks. And one thing that Bob Sewell, our EVP of Sales and Marketing, had instilled in me when I was running around with him all over God's green earth here was to make time for family. And so we called ourselves weekend warriors. So no matter what happened, we were getting home to be there for sports or family time on the weekend and shutting it down as best we could to spend that quality time. And then I would also say, even working with Todd over the years, I think as a younger cousin coming up as a family member in the business, there are times where you're like, hey, I should be doing more, or I need more, or I would like more responsibility, more input in the business. And as you kind of step back a minute and look at where you're at, I have to remind myself a lot that I'm 10 years younger than Todd. And I have a sister in the business who's a few years younger than me. And she's also had times where, she's thinking about, what about me, or what's next for us? I think probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I decided that when Todd and I like to go out and hike and fish and do all kinds of fun stuff outside of the business. And so for me, I decided that time was more important and special to me. So we keep all the family business part of that. I mean, every once in a while you're in the car and you might have a little conversation on the way up to wherever fun destination you're headed. But overall, really separated the time when we're spending together outside of the business, knowing that is way more important and special than, having a conversation about what's going on at work for the next few months or years.
I'll tag on to that discussion if you don't mind. I have a second question, which maybe I'll hold for later. But someone once said to me, one of the keys to success in business is that you need to, as a leader, understand that it's a marathon, not a sprint, so that you can pace yourself. And I have a lot of experience with baby boomers who have no life outside of their business, sadly to say, and it's tough for them as they get older because they have no balance. And it seems like you have balance. And was that an effort to build balance into your life? And what are some of the hobbies that you do have? I know that we have Brian Nagle, who is, a wannabe ski instructor, and Steve Wilchins, who's a wannabe, PGA Tour golf professional. So, I'm wondering what you guys do.
We're fortunate. As Steven said, our dads actually took us out fishing, hiking, and out on the boats. So we our relationships were forged more so in the wilderness, so to speak, than in the office and in the plant. So that's been very helpful. And actually, in the day when we were smaller, our vendors were with us too, which is kind of neat. An insurance agent would be on his boat. Our packaging supplier, we went to his house to go hunting. Like, these were the business was much more smaller and tied together. So it's kind of fun to see that mix. And we really never talked about business. during that time. And another small tip that I recommend, whether it's with Stephen and I, my wife has just become a corporate trainer at Blount. And I said, the first rule is we can't talk about employees. Let's not talk about a specific employee. It's difficult, and let that work through the bosses, through the supervision and HR. Same thing with small problems. Let's only deal with themes and big problems. And so that's also helped. But yeah, it's been fun. I think creating that outside, still being connected, but separated, I think is real valuable.
And does that work also? Does that philosophy carry through to the family council that Stephen brought up earlier?
Yeah, the family council is mostly my dad and his kids, and a little bit, yeah, and particularly because there's grandkids that are all different ages, so there's some value there. Opportunity for us for sure to build out maybe even a social component to that, but right now it's been just business, but we're working on that.
Right. So could you expand a little on the family council for people who don't have used that?
Sure. It's just a really neat way to bring pretty much family members who are either owners or beneficiaries together. Really could be talking about other things. You give them an update on the business, number one, but you might be talking about charitable giving, how the company did it, and we also, that particular family council has a fund to make donations from on behalf of the family. And then we also do outside topics. So it might be just investments, right? Everybody's either got a 401k or maybe their own investment portfolio. So we bring in outsiders. And then we also talk about the estate plan, what's going on in politics, taxes, and how the estate plan works so that we can be knowledgeable of it. So God forbid someone does pass away and will eventually, we know how it's set up and why things might be in a trust or why we do taxes a certain way. It's just mostly education, connection, and involvement.
Thank you. Speaking about trusts and estates, has your estates incorporated any entrepreneurial provisions in your estate plans for your beneficiaries? Or has it been more of a more traditional type of structure?
What do you mean by entrepreneurial provision?
Well, I mean, there's a theory that you can structure some of your trusts as more entrepreneurial, where you're engaging the beneficiary rather than having them as passive, and having them take a greater role and assuming more risk, but at the same time, it alleviates the concern about not working, not being motivated. So to the extent you have this fire and entrepreneurial spirit, can you convey that to the next generation?
Yeah, that's something I think about all the time. I think there's two ways to do that. One is for my kids, who I've created a smaller subcommittee of the family council because they have a very specific responsibility, and following groups like Jeffries, Mage, and FBA allows me to learn about best practices and to how to keep the next generation hungry. My number one goal is to make them great owners and to make sure that they are reinvesting in the business. And my number two goal is to educate them about the business itself and the sensitivity and the fragility of it all, right? It's not something that just happens by itself. And then lastly is humility, that each future owner has to be willing to almost let it all go, right? To be able to say what's best for the family and what's best for the business. I've been leading that by example, but I'm also trying to be specific about that. But I think as businesses evolve into the third, fourth, fifth generation, you really have to move towards a little bit of that family office concept where maybe there's some sub parts of the business that they can have maybe a little bit more leadership over. And that might be a way to be more entrepreneurial. If they only have a small piece of the business, we have a restaurant, that could be something. We have some real estate, something that's smaller that they can own. We have a wholly owned subsidiary in New Hampshire. Some of those things might be a way to let the beneficiaries be more entrepreneurial, to have a bigger role in a smaller part of the business.
Do you view that the family members get ownership from being born into the family, or do they need to work in the company to get it? And
wow, you're really going deep quick.
Sorry.
No, it's a great question. I mean, the ideal situation is that those that are working have more voting shares at a minimum and possibly more total ownership. But there's some timing to that, so you have to be careful on how you allocate within to the beneficiary. So you may put something in trust for their benefit, but leave some allocation rights open. But that being said, the end goal is that that someone in one of my kids would have control of the company so that they can also be entrepreneurial, make quick decisions, and be able to really move the company forward, while at the same time being equitable, where in some version of the word equitable to the other siblings, whether that's because they have a piece of the business or they're managing part of a future family office or maybe even charitable giving to some extent. So we're working through that right now, but I do believe, just from my own experience and the way my dad set it up, that keeping decision-making centralized as possible and keeping as few owners as possible is very good for the business and can be good for the family if you've created some good ways for previous generations to exit.
Todd, another thought may be when you're discussing this with your advisors is to think about a personal family trust company.
Yeah.
That's very easy to set up, and since you have the New Hampshire, operations, I think you could really take advantage of that. Very easy to set up, so you may want to explore that.
Thank you. I'll be looking into
that. Any other questions? I don't want to dominate.
One on philanthropy. I know you've mentioned that a couple times. Did that start at the more senior generation, the same charities? How are you using that within the business? Are you just selecting beneficiaries within your communities, or are you pairing that up with your business interests as well?
All of the above. We're definitely very fortunate. As Stephen knows, we have one big thing we can give away.
Soup.
We got a lot of soup. So feeding New England, Massachusetts, and all of the country in a lot of times, whether that's the food bank, that's been a constant theme. A little bit easier today. When we were a seafood company, it wasn't as easy. Some of the, like a lot of private businesses, the personal businesses, the personal organizations I'm involved with, we support as a company, but now we have layers. So we just created a new rule where anybody in the company can authorize a $500 sponsorship, right? If it's your town and it's the employees or your supervisor and the baseball league comes to you, just say yes. I don't care what the tier is, it's $500, right? Just do it. It's just so much easier. So we start there and we go all the way up to multi-layer between the family council fund to the corporate giving to our personal giving. And our executives each have money to give away as well. That all comes out of a donor advised fund. So we also have two nonprofits connected to the company that we raise money for. Some of that money goes to the community, and where applicable, we're actually able to support employees. Maybe there was a death in the family, and we can do that. Multiple.
Todd, do you publish where you're giving so that everybody in the company can see how you're doing? How the company is giving on a global level?
It's a great question. We don't do that well enough. We've done it on occasion where there's been kind of a moment, certainly on the food side, 1 million+ pounds. Of course, some of those pounds we didn't want to give away, but maybe the package was wrong or the customer discontinued the item. But a lot of it is intentional giving, and it's an area where we have the opportunity to do more. I think private companies often don't broadcast what they're doing. Some of it because they might be specific, maybe it's a religious organization or kind of a smaller, but I think there's more opportunity to do that, particularly given the layers, the layers of time, product, money, and then the ones that are these long-term, and allowing our employees to serve on boards and to serve just their time.
Well, we're going to turn it over to Jillian King. We've been ripping along and coming to the end of this segment. Jillian, turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for that compelling discussion about what makes a family business thrive. That wraps up part 2 of this spring 2025 FBA Family Business panel discussion. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers who have tuned in for this panel. Links will be provided below to part 1 if you didn't already hear it, and to part 3 of the discussion to hear more on these topics. And if you're a fan of our videos, please be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and press that bell button. And for more on this topic, tune in to our continuing series on family business success. Radio Entrepreneurs is also active on LinkedIn, so follow our page there for more business advice and topical business discussions all year round. Until next time, goodbye and thanks for listening. We'll be back with more stories on Radio Entrepreneurs.